The night smelled of roses and rain. Outside the Cole estate, a storm was gathering, clouds pressing low, wind bending the tall hedges that surrounded the mansion like a fortress. Inside, the echo of footsteps and murmured congratulations had faded long ago. The grand ballroom was empty now, its chandeliers still glittering from the wedding that had felt more like a negotiation than a celebration. Mila Hayes sat on the edge of a velvet chair, her white wedding dress heavy with the scent of fear. Her fingers were clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. The diamond ring on her hand, too large, too cold, didn't belong to her. The door creaked open, and one of the servants stepped in. "Mrs. Cole," he said softly, his eyes avoiding hers. "Mr. Cole is waiting upstairs. He asked that you stay in the east wing tonight." She nodded numbly. He led her down the endless hallway, the heels of her shoes echoing like a countdown. When the servant left, the sound of the door locking behind her felt like a sentence. The room was enormous, all marble and gold, a chandelier above her head, a fire that burned too bright. Yet the air felt cold. Mila wrapped her arms around herself and whispered, "Please, don't let this be real." But it was. Just this morning, she'd been an ordinary girl trapped by circumstance, an orphan whose guardian had sold her to erase his debts. Now she was Mrs. Frank Cole, the wife of a man the newspapers called the Ice King of Manhattan. They said he destroyed anyone who stood in his way, that he didn't believe in love, only in ownership. And now she was part of his empire. Hours passed. Midnight came. Mila sat on the edge of the bed, still in her gown, staring at the door. The storm outside had turned violent, thunder rumbling through the walls. When the clock struck 12, she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, getting closer. Her breath caught. The doorknob turned. The door opened. Frank Cole stood there, tall, composed, every inch of him radiating control. His black suit was unbuttoned, his tie undone, and his eyes, dark grey, unreadable, met hers. She scrambled backward, her hands shaking.
"Please don't hurt me." "I can't go," he froze.
For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, he exhaled. "I'm not going to hurt you, Mila." His voice was low, deep, more weary than cruel. He stepped closer, but not enough to frighten her. "I don't hurt people," he said, gaze steady, who already looked broken. The words sank into her like warm water, seeping through cold skin. She blinked, not sure she'd heard right. Frank turned away, moving toward the fireplace. He looked at the flames for a while, then said without turning around, "You can sleep here, or in any room you prefer."
"No one will touch you. Not even me." She stared at him, confused, her heart still pounding. Why do this?"
"Why marry me if—" "'Cause some debts are easier to pay with signatures," he cut in. His tone wasn't sharp, just tired.
"Good night, Mrs. Cole." And with that,
he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. Mila sat there for a long time, her breath uneven, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The house was silent again. The fire crackled softly. She stood, crossed the room, and pressed her ear against the door. But there was nothing. He was gone. Slowly, she looked around the room. The velvet curtains, the polished floors, the mirror that reflected her pale face and trembling hands. She no longer recognized the girl staring back in the reflection. She whispered to herself, "You're safe." For now. Outside, thunder rolled over the city, and somewhere down the corridor, the sound of Frank's footsteps faded into silence. For the first time that night, Mila realized she wasn't trapped by chains or locks. She was trapped by fear. Of a man she didn't understand, and of a future she hadn't chosen. But beneath that fear, something else flickered. Something small, fragile, and unfamiliar. Curiosity. The morning after her wedding, the mansion was silent. Sunlight crept through the tall windows, catching on the edges of the white curtains that swayed gently in the breeze. For a moment, Mila thought she'd dreamed it all. The storm, the vows, the fear. But when she looked down and saw the ring still heavy on her finger, she knew it was real. The east wing of the Cole estate was larger than any house she'd ever lived in. The ceilings were high enough to echo, the walls covered in portraits of people who looked too perfect to have ever felt anything as human as pain. She stood there in her simple nightdress, barefoot, unsure if she was allowed to walk beyond the room's threshold. No one had told her what to do next. 2 months earlier. The world had been much smaller then. Mila worked in a small bookstore on Fifth Avenue, living on a narrow budget and the kindness of strangers. She had been an orphan since she was 9, raised under the guardianship of Harold Pierce, a man who called himself a benefactor, but treated her more like an asset. When she turned 21, the debts he'd piled up in her name came due. He didn't ask her to sign anything this time. He simply said, "You're getting married." At first, she laughed, thought it was one of his cruel jokes. Then she saw the contract. Her name beside that of Frank Cole. "You can't be serious," she whispered. Harold only smiled. "He's offering more than you're worth, darling. You should be grateful." The next week was a blur, a flurry of fittings, documents, and lawyers.
Mila never saw Frank until the wedding day.
Even then, he barely looked at her. The ceremony took place in one of his hotels. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and guests who only came because of business ties. When she walked down the aisle, every pair of eyes followed her, curious, judgmental, whispering, "Who is she?" She doesn't even smile. Poor girl. Or maybe lucky, depending on what she wants. She didn't want anything. She only wanted to survive. When the officiant asked, "Do you, Mila Hayes, take this man?" her voice almost failed her. But Harold's hand on her shoulder was reminder enough. She nodded and said, "I do." The papers were signed before the cake was cut. The photos appeared in the tabloids the next morning. The coldest wedding of the year, billionaire Frank Cole marries unknown bride. They were right. It wasn't a love story. It was a transaction. Now, 1 month into the marriage, Mila learned to move quietly through the house. Breakfast was left outside her door. Dinner was served at 8, though Frank rarely appeared. He seemed to live inside his study, a place filled with books, screens, and secrets she didn't dare ask about. The staff treated her respectfully, but distantly, as if she were a ghost. Sometimes she'd catch glimpses of him, walking through the hall, taking a phone call by the window, his expression unreadable. Every time their eyes met, she froze. He'd nod politely, then continue on as if she were part of the furniture. It should have been easier that way, to be invisible, but the silence was unbearable. At night, when the world outside slept, Mila would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long she could endure this kind of emptiness. One evening, while reading in the library, she overheard 2 maids whispering near the door.
They say she's terrified of him. Wouldn't you be?
He's Frank Cole. Still, she's lucky. He could have chosen worse ways to settle a debt. Mila closed her book slowly, the words blurring. Lucky. Maybe they were right. He hadn't hurt her. He hadn't even touched her. But she wasn't sure which was worse, cruelty or indifference. At the end of that week, Frank returned home earlier than usual. She heard his car in the driveway, the low murmur of voices, the front door closing. Her heart raced for no reason she could name. She met him by accident in the hallway. She carrying a stack of towels, he loosening his tie after a long day. They both stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "You don't have to hide whenever I walk in, Mila." She flushed, gripping the towels tighter.
I I'm not hiding. His gaze softened. Barely noticeable, but enough for her to see it.
Good, because this house has enough ghosts. He walked past her before she could respond, but the words lingered. For the first time, Mila wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was one too. By the time March came, the cold had begun to loosen its grip on Manhattan. The snow outside the Cole mansion melted into thin streams that ran along the cobblestone drive, and the garden, lifeless for years, showed hints of green beneath the frost. Inside, however, the air remained cold. Mila had now lived there for nearly 2 months. The days followed a quiet rhythm, breakfast alone, reading in the library, wandering the hallways when she was sure Frank was away. The silence was both a comfort and a prison. The servants had grown used to her presence, but rarely spoke unless spoken to. Everyone in the house seemed to move according to Frank's unspoken rules, a rhythm of discipline and order, and yet he never gave her any rule to follow.
No curfew, no locked doors, no instructions. That was perhaps what frightened her most, the freedom.
It felt like being dropped into a vast ocean with no direction home. One afternoon she was carrying a tray of tea down the hall when she tripped over the corner of a rug. The porcelain cup fell and shattered against the marble floor, tea splattering across her dress. Her heart stopped. She knelt quickly, trembling, gathering the pieces with her bare hands. The sharp edge bit into her finger, and a drop of blood fell to the floor. "Leave it," a voice said behind her. She froze. Slowly, she turned. Frank stood a few steps away, still in his suit, jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened, as if he'd just come from work. His expression was unreadable. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice small.
"I'll clean it up right away." He glanced at the broken glass, then at her bleeding hand.
"It's just a cup, Mila, not a crime." She blinked, uncertain she'd heard him correctly. He stepped forward, took the towel from the tray and handed it to her. "You'll cut yourself worse if you keep that up." Their fingers brushed for half a second, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected shiver through her. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded once, then turned to leave. Before he did, he added, "Ask Mrs. Grant for antiseptic. You don't want it to get infected." Then he was gone. Mila sat back on her heels, towel pressed against her hand, staring after him. The house was silent again, but the echo of his voice lingered. Not a crime, it was such an ordinary phrase, but from him it felt almost like kindness. Days turned into weeks. The snow gave way to soft rain, and Mila began to explore beyond the east wing. She found herself drawn to the abandoned garden behind the mansion. The ground was still hard with frost, the rose bushes thorny and lifeless, but somehow it felt like a place that could breathe again. One morning she asked the gardener, "Do you mind if I help here?" The old man looked surprised. "No one's touched this garden in years, ma'am. Mr. Cole won't stop you, I suppose." So she began, slowly, carefully, pulling weeds, trimming dead stems, planting new roots. It gave her hands something to do, her heart something to hold. From the window of his office, Frank noticed. At first, he thought it was one of the staff. Then he saw the pale figure bending over the soil, the hem of her dress brushing the earth, sunlight touching her hair, and he stopped what he was doing. For reasons he didn't want to name, he couldn't look away. Later that evening, Mrs. Grant, the housekeeper, brought him his usual tea. She hesitated before leaving. "It's been a long time since the garden looked alive, sir." He glanced up. "The garden?" "Yes, Mrs. Cole's been working there every morning." He didn't respond, but something in his chest shifted. A flicker of something long forgotten. That night, when he passed through the hallway, he found the back doors slightly open. Mila was sitting on the stone steps, dirt on her hands, staring at the sky. "Does the garden keep you busy?" he asked. surprising even himself. She startled slightly, then turned.
I like quiet places. So do I, he said. They stood in silence.
The distance between them measured by more than just space. After a while, she asked softly, "Why did you keep the garden if you never came here?" He looked at the dark outline of the roses. "It belonged to my mother. I didn't have the heart to tear it down." Her gaze lingered on him, gentle. "Then maybe it's waiting for you to bring it back." He didn't answer. Just nodded once, then walked away. But that night, long after she'd gone to bed, Frank stood by his window and looked out at the garden again. For the first time in years, he imagined what it might look like in bloom. Spring settled in quietly. The house began to feel less like a museum and more like a place where life could exist, even if only in small, fragile moments. Mila noticed that the staff smiled more often now. Even Mrs. Grant seemed softer. One evening, as she passed through the hallway, she overheard two maids talking again.
Did you see the garden? It's beautiful. It's because of her. No,
It's because he lets her. She didn't know what to think of that, but for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. Weeks later, she found herself reading by the fire when Frank returned home early. He walked past her, paused, then said quietly, "You've made this place less empty." Her eyes lifted, startled. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't." He looked toward the window where the faint glow of the garden lights shimmered through the rain. Sometimes emptiness just needs someone to notice it. She didn't know what to say. But when he left, she realized something had changed. He no longer looked like the monster she'd feared. Now he looked
tired, human that night.
As she blew out the candles, she whispered into the dark, "Maybe fear isn't forever." Outside, the first roses of spring began to bloom, small, delicate, and impossibly brave. By early June, summer light spilled through every window of the Cole estate. The once lifeless garden had transformed. The roses now bloomed in shades of white, crimson, and blush. It was still imperfect, still recovering, but alive again. Mila had made a routine of it. She rose early, braided her hair, and went out barefoot into the morning dew. She would kneel among the flower beds, hum softly under her breath, and let the sun warm her back while her fingers brushed the soil. The gardener had grown fond of her. "She treats them like children," he told Mrs. Grant one morning. "Talks to them too. Says roses grow better when you listen." Mrs. Grant smiled faintly. Maybe that's what this house has been missing. Someone who listens. Inside, Frank watched from his office window. He hadn't meant to, not at first. He would simply pause between calls, his gaze drawn to the motion of her figure moving through the rows of roses. There was a stillness about her that unsettled him. Not weakness, but calmness. She seemed content in a way he hadn't been in years. One morning, his assistant found him staring out the window again. "Sir?" Frank blinked, straightened. "The file on Langston Group, is it ready?" But even as he spoke, part of him remained fixed on the garden below. It had been 5 months since the wedding. In that time, he had learned more about her than he intended. Not through conversation, but through observation. She liked tea without sugar. She read books until she fell asleep on the couch. She flinched at thunder but smiled at rain, and she always wore the same thin gold bracelet. Worn, scratched, clearly not expensive. He had once asked Mrs. Grant about it.
"Her sisters, I think," the older woman said softly.
The only thing she kept from her old life. Frank said nothing, but that night he couldn't stop picturing her sitting alone in the dim library, holding on to a memory that no one else could see. The following week, he decided to join her at breakfast for the first time. When Mila entered the dining room and saw him seated at the long mahogany table, she froze mid-step. "Good morning," he said.
as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Good morning," she managed.
Her voice small. He gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit, please." The word please sounded strange coming from him. They ate mostly in silence. The only sound was the soft clink of silverware and the faint rustle of the morning paper. At one point, Mila reached for the teapot just as he did. Their hands brushed, and she drew back quickly. "Sorry," she murmured. Frank looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to apologize for existing, Mila." The words came out quieter than he intended, almost a confession. She blinked, unsure how to respond.
"I just don't want to make things uncomfortable." His gaze softened slightly.
They already were.
"Long before you came," her breath caught.
The honesty in his tone felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Brief, startling, and gone before she could hold on to it. That evening, he stood by the window as the sunset painted the sky in gold and amber. From his vantage point, he could see her again in the garden, trimming roses. The faint sound of her laughter carried through the breeze, rare and gentle. Mr. Grant, the old gardener, was with her, pointing out how the roots had spread. "It's been years since anyone made this house feel alive," the old man said, not realizing Frank could hear him from above. Frank's hand stilled on the window frame. Alive. He hadn't thought of the word in years. Later that night, he found himself walking down the hallway that led to the garden doors. He wasn't sure what he was doing, only that something inside him wanted to be near that quiet warmth. He stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain-soaked roses. Mila was kneeling by the flower beds, gathering a few cut blooms into her basket. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. "Oh, I didn't see you there." He stopped a few feet away. "You've done a good job with them." She smiled faintly, brushing hair from her face. "They just needed a bit of care." "Everything does," he said without thinking. She looked at him, surprised.
"Even people?"
For a moment the question hung in the air. His eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Especially people," he said finally. Neither moved for several seconds. Then he turned toward the house, his voice low. "You can keep the garden as yours. No one will disturb it." When he left, Mila stood there for a long while, her heart beating too fast. She didn't understand what had changed, only that something had. The next morning, she found a new pair of gardening gloves laid neatly on the stone table. Soft leather, her size tied with a thin white ribbon. No note, no name. But she didn't need one. She smiled, slipped them on, and whispered to the roses, "He's not as cold as he looks, is he?" Inside his study, Frank sat with his morning coffee, pretending to read the paper. He wasn't smiling, but there was a faint softness in his eyes, the kind that comes when something frozen remembers what it feels like to thaw. By the end of September, the nights had grown cooler, and the roses outside were beginning to fade. The air smelled faintly of rain and earth, the scent of endings and quiet beginnings. Mila had settled into the rhythm of the house. She still moved gently, cautiously, but the fear that once paralyzed her had softened into awareness. She knew which floors creaked, which doors groaned, which rooms Frank preferred to work in when he came home late. It had been nearly 7 months since their wedding. 7 months of silence, glances, and a strange, wordless understanding that hovered between them. That evening, the mansion was quieter than usual. The staff had retired early, leaving only the sound of rain tapping softly against the windows.
Mila couldn't sleep.
She had noticed the light still on in Frank's study, the same light that burned almost every night. She hesitated at first, standing at the end of the corridor, a tray of tea in her trembling hands. But something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps concern, pushed her forward. She knocked softly. Mr. Cole? His voice came from inside, calm but tired.
Come in. She stepped into the room.
The faint glow of the desk lamp lit his face, the sharp lines softened by exhaustion. Papers were scattered across the table, the ash of an untouched cigar still curling faintly in the tray. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting the tray down. He looked up. "You don't have to bring me tea, Mila." "I know," she said quietly, "but I wanted to." He studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You've changed since you came here?" Her brow furrowed slightly.
Have I?
"You don't flinch when you speak anymore." Mila let out a small breath. Not quite a laugh, but close. "I'm learning the house isn't as haunted as it feels." He raised an eyebrow. "Haunted?" "By silence," she said. "Sometimes it feels like it's listening." He looked around the vast, quiet room. "Maybe it is." A moment of silence passed between them. Not uncomfortable, but heavy with thoughts neither dared to voice. Then he asked, his tone softer, "Do you ever stop being afraid?" The question caught her off guard. She turned her eyes to the window, where the rain shimmered against the glass. "Fear keeps me careful," she said finally. "It's the reason I survived." But sometimes, she hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of the teacup.
"Sometimes I wish I could forget it, just to know what it feels like to breathe without it." Frank's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly.
He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "You don't forget fear," he said. "You just learn to live beside it." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight.
"Is that what you do?"
He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the fireplace, where the embers pulsed faintly like a heartbeat.
"Every day," he said finally. "And some days it wins." Mila's chest tightened.
She'd never heard him sound like that. Not the ruthless billionaire everyone whispered about, but a man quietly fighting something invisible. He reached for the teacup she'd brought. Their hands brushed, just for a moment, and this time neither pulled away. The warmth of his skin startled her. Steady, human. "Thank you," he murmured. "It's just tea," she said softly. His eyes met hers. "No, it's not." The words hung in the air, simple, yet full of meaning neither could unravel. Mila smiled faintly, uncertain, and took a step back.
"I should let you work." But before she reached the door, he said quietly, "Mila." She turned. "Don't let the silence fool you," he said.
"This house isn't as empty as it seems." Her lips parted, but no words came. She only nodded once and slipped out of the room. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain felt softer somehow. Not lonely, but comforting. She lay in bed, remembering the tone of his voice when he said her name. He'd spoken it not like a command, not like an obligation, but as if testing the sound, as if it meant something. She turned toward the window where the last drops of rain traced silver lines down the glass. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid of tomorrow. In the study below, Frank sat motionless for a long time after she left. The tea had gone cold, untouched. He stared at the door, then at the faint mark her hand had left on the tray. For years, he'd trained himself to stay untouched, to never let warmth get close enough to burn. But tonight, something had changed. He looked out at the garden through the rain, the roses she had brought back to life, and realized he hadn't thought of the past once while she was in the room. That realization scared
him more than anything else. The next morning,
when Mila came down for breakfast, she noticed a small addition to the table setting, a second teacup beside hers. She looked up and saw Frank already seated across from her. "Good morning," he said simply. Her lips curved in surprise. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," he replied, pouring tea into both cups. He didn't mention last night, neither did she. But as he handed her the cup, their fingers brushed again, not by accident this time. And in that quiet exchange, the first fragile thread of trust between them was tied. By late winter, snow had blanketed the city outside the coal estate. The gardens, once blooming with the color of spring, now slept beneath sheets of white. Inside, the mansion had grown warmer, not from the fireplaces alone, but from the quiet rhythm of two people learning to exist side by side. It had been nearly 10 months since their wedding, 10 months of distance turning slowly into familiarity, of silence turning into soft conversation. Mila now tended to the rose garden every morning, even in the cold. She would brush away the snow from the roots and whisper, as if the flowers could hear her. "You'll bloom again soon," she would say softly. Sometimes, from the window of his study, Frank would watch her, that small, determined figure in the grey winter light, and something in him would ache without reason. One morning, as Mila arranged fresh lilies in a vase, she overheard two maids whispering nearby. "They say Mr. Cole used to be a lawyer," one said, "before everything happened." "Everything?" the other asked, wide-eyed. The first maid lowered her voice. "He had a company and in a partner he trusted."
That man stole everything. Money, clients, even what?
"Someone he loved." Mila froze, her fingers tightening around the vase. The lilies trembled. That evening, curiosity, and something deeper, led her to the study again. Frank was there, as always, the amber glow of the desk lamp outlining his shoulders. "You used to be a lawyer," she said quietly from the doorway. He didn't look up.
I was. For long?
"Too long," she hesitated. "What made you stop?" For a moment, only silence. Then he set down his pen and looked at her, not with anger, but with the exhaustion of someone who's been asked to reopen a wound. "People," he said simply. "I built a firm with someone I called a friend. We dreamed together, worked nights without sleep. Then one day, I woke up and found out everything had been transferred. Ownership, clients, reputation."
All of it gone. Mila stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly. "And the woman?"
He flinched almost imperceptibly. She chose the winning side. She wished she hadn't asked. The pain in his eyes was enough. He turned away, his jaw tightening. "After that, I decided emotions are liabilities."
They make you careless.
"And carelessness costs everything." Mila's heart ached. She saw the man beneath the armor, the one who once believed in loyalty and love, only to be left standing in the ruins of both. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said flatly. "It taught me what matters, and what's that? Control." She wanted to tell him control wasn't the same as peace, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she just nodded and said softly, "Maybe peace matters too." For the first time, his eyes flickered with something, surprise, perhaps even confusion. The following weeks carried a quiet shift between them. Frank began spending more time outside his study. He joined her in the garden once, awkwardly holding a small watering can. "You don't have to help," Mila said, smiling faintly. "I know," he replied.
But you make it look.
"Important. It is," she said. "It's the only thing that grows because I care, not because I'm told to." He watched her kneel among the roses, her gloves brushing the frozen stems. "You believe things can come back from the dead?" She looked up at him. "I think they just need someone to stay long enough." Something unspoken passed between them then, a quiet understanding that neither dared to name. One night, as the wind howled outside, Mila passed by his study again and noticed a photograph on the desk. It was old, worn, Frank in his 20s, smiling beside a man who looked like him but softer, younger. Between them, a woman with kind eyes. Her heart tightened. She placed the photo face down, not out of anger, but respect. When Frank entered moments later, he noticed. "You saw it," he said simply. "I didn't mean to." He nodded slowly. That was the last day I smiled for a camera. She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "Maybe it's time you took another one." He almost smiled. Almost. Not yet. Later that night, Mila sat by the window in her room, watching the snow fall. She thought about the way his voice had softened when he spoke of the past, the way he seemed both powerful and fragile at once. She realized she no longer feared him. She pitied him. And beneath that pity, something gentler, something she couldn't name, had begun to bloom. Downstairs, Frank poured himself a drink and stood by the window, looking out at the dark garden where a few stubborn roses still clung to life despite the frost. He didn't understand why her presence lingered in his thoughts, why her voice, quiet, patient, forgiving, seemed to echo in the silence. Maybe because, for the first time in years, someone wasn't afraid of him, he whispered to the empty room. Maybe peace matters too. And for the first time the words didn't feel foolish. Spring returned slowly, brushing the city with soft light and thawing the last traces of snow. The Cole mansion, once draped in winter's silence, began to breathe again. Roses crept back to life under Mila's hands, the air filling with faint perfume and birdsong. It had been almost a full year since the night she was forced into this marriage, a year that had changed her more than she'd ever imagined. From a trembling bride to a woman who had begun to rediscover her own voice. But peace, she soon learned, was fragile. It began with a letter. A plain white envelope slipped under her door one afternoon. Her name was scrawled across it in uneven ink. Mila frowned. No one ever sent her letters here. Inside a single sheet of paper. You think you can hide behind your new husband's money?
I know who you really are, Mila, or should I say, the orphan girl from Eastwood Home. If he finds out, what do you think he'll do? Pay me, and this stays between us. Her hands trembled as she read.
The words blurred. She could almost smell the stale hallway of the orphanage again, hear the echoes of children crying at night. That place, her biggest shame, the part of her life she'd buried so deep, now clawed its way back. That evening, she avoided Frank's gaze at dinner. He noticed. "You're quiet tonight," he said, setting down his glass. "I'm just tired," she murmured, forcing a smile, but her voice was thin, her hands restless. He didn't press further, though his eyes lingered on her longer than usual. The next day, she went into town, something she rarely did alone. The address written in the letter led to a cheap cafe near the docks. Her heart pounded as she entered. The smell of fried oil and cigarette smoke filled the air. At a corner table sat him, her former guardian, Mr. Holden, once a man of fine suits and slick hair, now bloated, his face red and eyes mean. "Well,
If it isn't my sweet Mila," he said, with a crooked grin.
Or should I say Mrs. Cole? She froze. "What do you want?"
"Money," he said, leaning back.
"That husband of yours can afford it."
Let's say
"$1 million to keep my mouth shut about your lovely little past." Her breath caught.
you wouldn't. Oh, I would.
Newspapers pay good money for stories about the billionaire's orphan bride. You'd be surprised how much people love a scandal. Her vision blurred.
Shame, fear, anger, all twisted inside her. I don't have that kind of money, he shrugged.
Then ask your husband. Or maybe he'll throw you out once he learns what you really are. Tears stung her eyes. She turned and ran before he could see them fall. That night she sat in her room, the letter crumpled in her hand. She wanted to tell Frank, she wanted to trust him, but a small, cruel voice whispered inside her, "He'll think you deceived him. He'll see you as dirt again." So she stayed silent. Until the next evening, when Frank came home early and found the letter on her desk. Mila. His voice was calm, but his eyes, cold steel.
Who sent this?
She froze, guilt and fear rushing through her.
It's nothing, please, just, he cut her off. Don't lie to me, her voice cracked. It's from someone I used to know. Before all this. Who?
She swallowed hard.
My guardian. He's blackmailing me. For a long moment, Frank said nothing.
His jaw flexed. The silence between them grew heavy. Then he exhaled slowly, the calm before a storm. What did he ask for? Money, $1 million. He nodded once. Where is he?
Frank, please, where?
Down by the docks.
But don't... He was already walking out. By the time she caught up to him, he was stepping into his car, his driver waiting. Frank, please don't do this.
He's dangerous. He turned to her, eyes colder than she'd ever seen. Dangerous, he said quietly. Not anymore. The car door shut, leaving her trembling on the steps, the night air thick around her. Hours later, the car returned. Frank stepped out, his shirt collar loosened, his knuckles faintly bruised.
Mila ran to him, her voice shaking.
What did you do? He met her gaze, unflinching. Handled it, her heart pounded. What does that mean? It means he won't bother you again. She stared at him, stunned.
You didn't hurt him?
He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his tone suddenly fierce, not angry, but protective. No one touches what's mine, Mila. The words struck something deep inside her. She should have been afraid. And yet, she wasn't. Because for the first time she realized he wasn't talking about possession. He was talking about care. Her voice broke. You didn't have to. I did, he said softly.
Because you would have faced it alone.
And I can't let that happen. She looked up at him, the storm in his eyes slowly fading into something gentler. Frank, she whispered. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his hand trembling ever so slightly. Don't hide from me again. I was afraid, I know, he said. So was I. And for a moment, the walls between them crumbled, not with grand declarations, but with a silence that said everything they couldn't. Later that night, when he finally left her at the doorway of her room, she whispered to the darkness, Maybe I'm not afraid anymore. Down the hall, Frank stood in his study, looking out the window where the garden glowed faintly under moonlight. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace, fragile but real. It had been nearly a year since that first stormy wedding night. Now the house no longer echoed with silence, but with signs of life. Footsteps, faint laughter, the soft rhythm of piano keys that Mila had started playing again. Frank often found her sitting in the garden, reading under the sunlight, her hair catching the wind. The air around her seemed lighter, and for the first time in years, he didn't mind slowing down just to breathe beside her. Peace had become their new normal, but peace never lasts long in the world of men who've made too many enemies. It began on a Thursday morning. Frank was in his study when his phone buzzed, a call from an unknown number. Normally he would ignore it, but something about the silence on the line made him answer. A distorted voice came through.
Hello, Mr. Cole. I hear you've gone soft. His grip tightened around the phone.
Who is this?
You don't recognize me.
That hurts. A pause. Then maybe you'll remember this name. Elliot Crane. Frank froze.
That name hit like ice down his spine. Elliot, the man who'd betrayed him.
The one who'd stolen his firm, his fortune, his lover, and vanished before Frank could destroy him. Frank's voice dropped to a deadly calm. What do you want? The man chuckled. Oh, nothing much. Just wanted to return a favor. You took everything from me after you rebuilt, Frank. Now I'll take something from you. The line went dead. Within an hour, the mansion was chaos. Security was doubled, calls made, cameras checked. But Mila, she was nowhere to be found. Her phone lay on the kitchen counter, the last text message unfinished. Frank, I'll be back before dinner. Just going into town for... That was 3 hours ago. Frank's chest tightened. He knew this feeling. The cold pull of helplessness, the echo of losing everything. He would not endure it again. By dusk he was on the road. His driver, Marcus, sat beside him as they sped toward the outskirts of the city. "She was taken near the old pier," Marcus said grimly. "One of the guards found tire marks, black van, no plates." Frank's eyes were fixed ahead.
"And the police?"
"Not yet. You said no authorities." "Good," Frank replied. "This doesn't go public." "Not until she's home." He didn't blink, didn't speak again. The headlights sliced through fog, the engine growling as if mirroring his rage. Meanwhile, Myla woke to darkness. Her wrists were tied, her head pounding. The air reeked of gasoline and rust. She was in an abandoned warehouse. She could tell by the echo of dripping water and the chill that seeped through the concrete floor. Footsteps approached. "Good morning."
"Mrs. Cole," a voice said, smooth and venomous. Her heart raced.
The man stepped into the faint light. Tall, sharp features, eyes filled with cruel delight. "Elliot Crane," he introduced himself with a smirk. "Your husband's—"
"Oldest friend." Mila's voice trembled.
"What do you want from me?" "Nothing you can give," he said. "But your husband can. See, Frank ruined me, took back what I built, made me a ghost. Now I'm going to make him watch what it feels like to lose everything again." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes.
"He won't let you." He leaned in close.
He already did. When Frank's car screeched to a halt outside the warehouse, he didn't wait for backup. He pushed open the door, gun in hand, eyes burning with something primal. Inside, the flicker of dim lights revealed what he feared most. Myla, bound to a chair, her face pale but unbroken. "Frank!" she gasped, voice cracking. Elliot stepped out from the shadows, clapping slowly.
"Always the hero, aren't you?"
Frank raised his gun.
"Let her go," Elliot laughed. "You're not in court anymore, Cole. You can't negotiate your way out of this. Try me." The tension thickened like smoke.
Rain lashed against the windows. Thunder rolled in the distance. Elliot smirked. "You took my company, my life, my future."
"So I'll take yours." He raised his gun. But before he could fire, Frank lunged.
The two men crashed into the metal floor, shots ringing through the building. Myla screamed, struggling against her ropes. One bullet shattered a window.
Another tore through a beam overhead. Sparks flew. Frank overpowered Elliot, disarming him.
He pressed the gun to his chest.
"Do it!" Elliot spat.
"Be the monster they say you are." Frank's finger tightened, then stopped. He threw the gun aside and said coldly, "No, monsters don't save people." Then he turned, rushing to Myla, his hands trembling as he untied her ropes. She fell into his arms, shaking. "Frank?" He held her close, whispering against her hair. "I once lost everything because I didn't protect it."
"I won't make that mistake again." Outside,
sirens wailed in the distance. Marcus had called for help after all. Frank helped Myla into the car, his arm never leaving her shoulders. As they drove away, she turned to him, eyes glistening.
"You could have killed him." "I could have," he said quietly.
"But then I'd lose something else. You." For the first time, she reached for his hand and held it. "You didn't lose me." He looked down at their joined hands, the smallest smile ghosting his lips. "No," he murmured. "This time I didn't." The rain hadn't stopped. It followed them all the way home, streaking down the car windows like silver tears. The city lights blurred outside as Myla sat beside Frank, her hands pressed to his arm, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice shaking.
"Please, Frank." He didn't respond. His head rested against the seat, his skin pale, his breath uneven. Marcus drove faster, his knuckles white on the wheel.
10 more minutes, Mrs. Cole. Just 10, but every second felt like eternity. When they reached the mansion, Myla refused to let anyone touch him at first. She clung to him as the staff rushed forward. "Get Dr. Fields here, now!"
Marcus barked. Within minutes, the house became a flurry of movement.
The doctor arrived, blood-stained bandages piling beside the bed, the smell of antiseptic filling the air. Mila stood near the door, her wedding ring twisting in her trembling fingers. Frank lay unconscious, his chest rising and falling shallowly. The doctor looked up, his expression grave but calm.
He lost a lot of blood, but the wound's clean. He'll make it, if he rests. Those words barely reached her.
She only heard the if. That night, the mansion went quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of distance. It was the silence of fear. Mila sat beside Frank's bed, a candle flickering on the nightstand. Her eyes were swollen, her hands cold. She hadn't cried this much since the night she'd lost her parents. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You shouldn't have come for me," she whispered, voice cracking. "You could have died." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. He had to come, because somewhere between all their battles and silences, they had found something worth fighting for. Hours passed. The clock ticked softly. She dozed off in the chair beside him, her hand still wrapped around his. In her dreams, she saw the warehouse again. The gun, the rain, his voice whispering, "I won't make that mistake again." When she woke, it was dawn. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting the room gold. Frank was still, his breathing faint but steady. She poured a glass of water, her hands trembling, and leaned closer.
"Please wake up," she whispered.
"I need you to see me, to know I'm still here." Her tears fell onto his hand. Then, as if pulled back by her voice, his fingers twitched. "Frank?" she gasped. His eyes fluttered open, grey and weary, but alive. "Mila!" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. She pressed a hand over her mouth, choking back a sob.
"You're awake." He tried to sit up, wincing, but she stopped him. "Don't move."
"You're hurt." He gave a faint, tired smile.
"You look worse than I do." She laughed through tears, shaking her head.
"Don't joke right now." He looked at her, really looked, at the red rims of her eyes, the worry carved into her face.
"You stayed." "Of course I did," she whispered. "You think I'd leave you after what you did for me?"
His gaze softened.
"I didn't do it because I had to, Mila. I did it because—"
He hesitated, his voice dropping. "Because I couldn't lose you." Her chest tightened. The words she'd kept buried for months clawed their way out. "I thought I'd lose you before I even got to tell you," she said, tears spilling freely now. "That I'm not afraid anymore." He blinked, confused. "Not afraid of what?" "Of you."
"Of this house. Of loving you." Frank's breath caught for a long moment.
There was only silence, heavy, fragile, full of things neither of them knew how to say. Then slowly, he reached for her hand, his fingers tracing the back of it like a promise. "You saved me long before tonight," he whispered. She frowned softly. "What do you mean?" "The first time you smiled in this house," he said, "something inside me changed."
"I just didn't realize it until now." Her tears turned into a shaky laugh.
"You have a strange way of saying thank you," he smiled faintly. "Then let me say it properly." He lifted her hand, kissed it, and whispered, "Thank you for staying." That evening, Mila opened the windows of his room. The rain had stopped, leaving the garden glistening under the pale moonlight. The roses she'd tended now shimmered with droplets of silver. Frank stirred, his eyes following her.
"You should rest." She turned, smiling softly.
"I will, after you sleep," he chuckled weakly. "You're impossible." I learned from the best. Their laughter, quiet, genuine, filled the room, replacing the sterile air of fear with something warm, something alive. As she dimmed the lights and settled into the chair beside him again, Frank murmured, "You're not afraid anymore." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "Not of life, not of love." He closed his eyes, the faintest smile on his lips. "Then maybe we both survived." Mila reached for his hand, holding it tightly.
"No, Frank," she whispered.
"We started living." Outside, the roses swayed gently in the night breeze, their petals unfolding under the moonlight. just as two hearts once locked in fear had finally learned how to open again. Spring melted fully into summer, and with it came warmth, not just in the air, but in the walls of the coal estate itself. The mansion that had once felt like a museum now pulsed with quiet life. Curtains were opened, sunlight streamed through the halls. Laughter, rare and fleeting but real, began to echo through the rooms. It had been nearly 3 months since that night in the warehouse. Frank's wounds had healed, though the scar on his side remained. He wore it like a reminder, not of pain, but of everything he'd nearly lost. Mila still woke early every morning. The habit had begun when she was too anxious to sleep while he recovered, and now it lingered. She would slip into the garden before breakfast, basket in hand, and tend to the roses she had once feared to touch. The garden had always been a strange place for her, a quiet witness to her transformation. She remembered the first time she stood here, barely able to breathe, terrified of everything. Now it was her sanctuary. Frank found her there one morning, crouched among the rose bushes, humming softly. The sunlight caught in her hair, the hem of her dress brushing the dew-covered grass. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Mila turned, smiling. "Habit. These roses don't take weekends off." He walked closer, his steps slow, still careful from his injury. "You talk to them like they understand you." "They do," she replied, gently brushing a petal. "They grew back because someone believed they could." He tilted his head. "Someone?" She smiled. "You let me stay here, didn't you?" That was enough. For a moment, silence hung between them. Not cold or awkward, but peaceful. Frank looked around the garden, the roses stretching in every direction, blooming in colors he'd forgotten existed. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. "You've changed everything." Mila laughed softly. "I just watered the flowers, Frank. The rest was already here." Later that morning, they sat together on the garden bench with tea and croissants, a ritual that had somehow become theirs. The air smelled of jasmine and freshly cut grass. Mila handed him a cup, teasing, "Careful, it's hot."
"Last time you burned your tongue," he raised an eyebrow. "And you laughed for a full minute." "I regret nothing," she said, grinning. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're getting bold, Mrs. Cole." "Bold?"
she echoed. "Or just comfortable." That made him pause. "Comfortable," he repeated, tasting the word like it was foreign to him. "It's been a long time since I felt that." Mila looked at him, her voice gentle. "And don't let it slip away this time." He met her gaze, and something flickered in his chest. Not the sharp sting of regret, but the quiet warmth of belonging. As the day grew brighter, they worked together in the garden. Mila pruned the roses while Frank helped clear the weeds along the stone path. "You know," he said, watching her snip a stem with careful precision, "you're much braver than you think." She looked up, surprised. "Brave? I was terrified of you for months." "And yet you stayed," he said softly, "even when you had every reason to run." Mila straightened, her hands brushing against the thorns.
"Maybe because I saw someone else who was just as scared." He blinked, taken aback. "Of what?" "Of feeling again." He didn't respond right away.
The truth of her words hit harder than he expected. For a man who had built empires on control, it was strange, freeing, even, to realize someone had seen through the armor he'd worn for so long. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the garden in gold, Frank lingered beside her among the blooming roses. "Do you remember?" he said quietly. "The first night you came here?"
"How could I forget?"
she said, laughing softly.
"I thought you were going to lock me in the basement." He smirked faintly.
"I was tempted," she gasped in mock outrage, then smiled when he chuckled, a sound so rare it made her heart swell. He turned serious again, his gaze tracing the outline of her face. "Back then, everything in this house was a transaction.
Every person, every moment, every decision, all business."
You were supposed to be the same." Her smile faded slightly.
A contract, he nodded.
Yes, you were my contract. Then he took a deep breath and added, but now...
You're my choice, Mila froze.
The air between them seemed to shimmer. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they'd lived through. The fear, the fights, the long, aching silences. Her eyes softened. That's the first time you've ever said something like that. Then I should have said it sooner, he murmured. She smiled through the tears forming in her eyes. You're not the man I married, Frank. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, No, because you taught me how to be someone better. As twilight fell, they stood together by the fountain in the center of the garden, the same place Mila once cried, wishing to disappear. Now she stood there laughing, her fingers intertwined with his. The roses swayed around them, their petals catching the light of the lanterns, and for the first time the mansion no longer felt haunted by loneliness. It felt like home, and as they walked back toward the house, Frank whispered, Thank you for believing in me when I didn't. Mila squeezed his hand. You didn't need belief, Frank. You just needed someone to stay. He smiled. And you did? They paused at the doorway, the scent of roses following them inside, the scent of survival, forgiveness, and something beautifully new. Morning light spilled gently into the east wing of the mansion, sliding over silk curtains and warm oak floors. Birds sang outside the window, their melody weaving softly into the hush of the early hour. Mila moved quietly through the kitchen, the scent of fresh tea and honey drifting in the air. She poured the amber liquid into 2 porcelain cups, the same set they had used on the first morning after their wedding, though everything else had changed since then. She smiled to herself as she arranged the tray. The memory of that first breakfast flashed in her mind, her trembling hands, the silence that had stretched like a wall between them, the fear of doing something wrong. Now her hands were steady. When she entered the study, Frank was already awake, sitting by the window with a newspaper on his lap. The morning light caught the faint scar along his jaw, turning it into something almost graceful, a mark of survival.
Not defeat. Good morning, she said softly.
Setting the tray down, he looked up, a slow smile touching his lips. You're up early again. I thought you might want tea before the day begins. He folded the newspaper. You read my mind. Hardly, she teased. You're impossible to read. Not to you, he replied, voice low but certain. Mila laughed, handing him his cup. Careful, it's hot. He accepted it, their fingers brushing, the briefest touch but warm enough to linger. You always say that, he said, raising an eyebrow. Do you think I'll never learn? She smiled, settling into the chair across from him. It's my job to remind you, he sipped, then looked at her over the rim of the cup. Still careful? Mila paused, her eyes meeting his.
Careful enough not to lose what I love. The air stilled.
The words hung between them, soft but powerful. The kind of truth that didn't need to be repeated. Frank set his cup down and reached across the table, his hand finding hers. You won't, he said quietly. Not this time. After breakfast they walked together through the garden. The morning dew clung to the petals, making them shimmer in the sunlight. Bees floated lazily between the blooms. Frank watched Mila kneel beside a rose bush, clipping away a wilted stem. You've turned this place into paradise, he murmured. She looked up, her eyes bright. It was always beautiful. It just needed time, he smiled. You sound like you're talking about me. Maybe I am, she said softly. He reached out, brushing his fingers along the back of her hand. Then I owe you more than I can ever repay. You don't owe me anything, Frank, she replied, standing. You gave me something I never thought I'd have again, safety. He tilted his head.
And what about love?
Mila's smile deepened. That too.
But I didn't need you to give it to me. I just needed to see it was there. They walked slowly along the stone path, the sound of their steps mingling with birdsong.
Frank stopped near the fountain, the one that had once been dry and forgotten. Now it sparkled with clear water, reflecting the blue of the morning sky. "This fountain," he said thoughtfully, "used to annoy me."
The sound of the water, I thought it was too loud.
"Too alive," Mila laughed gently.
And now?
He looked at her. "Now I can't imagine silence without it." She stepped closer, her hand brushing against his chest.
Because silence isn't emptiness anymore, he nodded slowly.
"Because you're in it." For a long moment, they stood there, the world around them quiet, save for the trickling of water and the faint hum of wind through the roses. As the sun rose higher, they made their way back to the terrace. Frank pulled out a chair for her, then sat beside her instead. Mila poured the last of the tea, and they drank in easy silence. When she leaned her head against his shoulder, he exhaled softly, a sound that felt like peace. "Do you ever think about that first night?" she asked. He hesitated.
Sometimes.
"Mostly to remind myself how far we've come." She smiled faintly. "I was terrified of you." "I was terrified of myself," he admitted. "You looked at me like I was capable of hurting you, and maybe back then I was." She lifted her head, meeting his eyes.
Not anymore. No, he said quietly.
"Not anymore." He reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You taught me something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "That love doesn't need rules or contracts or control."
It just needs someone to stay. Mila's eyes softened.
"And I'm not going anywhere," he smiled.
Good, because I'm not letting you.
She laughed, leaning closer. "Still possessive, Mr. Cole?" "Only with you," he said. The sunlight grew warmer, spilling over them. In the distance, the garden shimmered in full bloom, roses, lilies, and soft pink peonies swaying in the breeze. Mila looked out at the view, her voice a whisper. "You know, when I first came here, I thought this house would swallow me whole." Frank followed her gaze. "Now it's where you belong," she nodded, smiling through the tears she didn't bother to hide. "Now it's home." He took her hand, kissing it gently. "Welcome home, Mila." The story ended the way all good things begin, not with grand gestures or fireworks, but with quiet mornings, warm tea, and two souls who had learned to find peace, not in perfection, but in each other. As they walked back into the house, hand in hand, the camera of life pulled away slowly, leaving behind the image of a garden in full bloom and two people who had finally found where they were meant to be.